Welcome to the outdoor worship space at St. Michael and All Angels Anglican Church. My name is Donna Wall and I serve as priest of this parish. In this ordinary time, that is also extraordinary time, we gather on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people and the Tsartlip Nation. We give thanks for them and for the journey we share, a journey that has been so marked by deep grief and suffering as they lament and mourn the loss of children buried in unmarked graves. We are called to listen, to hear their stories, their laments. We are called to witness their sorrow and to pray and work with them for the healing of the whole world. In our liturgical calendar, we are in a long stretch of ordinary time, symbolized for us with the color green, a color of growth and renewal. In this summer season, we share in the stories of God's prophets as they struggle, ponder, question, wrestle, and learn. And into that mix, we listen for the gospel and for Jesus' invitation to us to bring our stories into this wondrous mix. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship. We come in worship to God, in our need and bringing with us the needs of the world. We come to God, who comes to us in Jesus, and who knows by experience what human life is like. We come with our faith and our doubts. We come with our hopes and our fears. We come as we are, because it is God who invites us to come, and God has promised never to turn us away. Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hidden. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name, through Christ our Lord. Amen. We are here, God. We have felt your touch in the sunlight, seen your power in the salt waves. We have wondered at the mystery of the stars, and we marvel that the Maker of the universe knows us by name. We are here, God. We are here to praise and worship you. We are here, Jesus. We know that you came to find us. We have listened to your words and smiled at your stories. We have felt the warmth of your love, and we thank you that you have called us friends. We are here, Jesus. We are here to praise and worship you. We are here, Holy Spirit. We are grateful for your presence, grateful for the way you bring us close, for the way you comfort and challenge us. We are here to praise and worship you. We are here, God, in this moment, in this place, and we thank you that you are here with us. You know us, God. We do not have to pretend with you. In the silence of your love, we bring you the things that trouble us, that harm us, that make us feel ashamed or afraid. God, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. God, have mercy on us. Listen to the words of Jesus, words that we can trust. Don't be afraid. Your sins are forgiven. You are loved. Come and follow me. Thanks be to God for these words of life. Steadfast God, your prophet set the plumb line of your righteousness and truth in the midst of your people. Grant us the courage to judge ourselves against it. Straighten all that is crooked or warped within us until our hearts and souls stretch upright, blameless, and holy to meet the glory of Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Let us listen for the word of God.
A reading from Amos. This is what the Lord God showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, said to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. For the word of God in Scripture, for the word of God among us, for the word of God within us, thanks be to God.
I will listen to what you, Lord God, are saying, for you are speaking peace to your faithful people and those who turn their hearts to you. Surely your salvation is at hand for those who fear you, that your glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet, righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before you, and peace will make a pathway for your feet.
A reading from Ephesians. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, just as he chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before him in love. He destined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace that he freely bestowed on us in the Beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace that he lavished on us. With all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure that he sets forth in Christ, as a plan for the fullness of time, to gather up all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. In Christ we have also obtained an inheritance, having been destined according to the purpose of him who accomplishes all things according to his counsel and will, so that we, who were the first to set our hope on Christ, might live for the praise of his glory. In him you also, when you have heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and had believed in him, were marked with the seal of the promised Holy Spirit. This is the pledge of our inheritance towards redemption as God's own people, to the praise of his glory. For the word of God in Scripture, for the word of God among us, for the word of God within us, thanks be to God.
The Lord be with you. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. King Herod heard of the healings being performed by Jesus and the disciples, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptizer on a platter." The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oath and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. The Gospel of Christ.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. In Coventry Cathedral there is a sculpture by Clark Fitzgerald called The Plumb Line and the City, which depicts the city with the plumb line of judgment hanging over it. I remember this sculpture very well because I did a painting of it a number of years ago, and before that, as a young child, my dad explained it to me, what it meant and what the plumb line represented. In the first reading today from Amos, we hear that the Lord was standing behind a wall built with a plumb line, with the plumb line in his hand, and he says, "See, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by." Now, it's been a few years and I needed a refresher on what a plumb line is, so I consulted the family plumber. And our son Neil told me that you attach something called a plumb bob to a string that is used to translate measurements from the ground to the ceiling to ensure that a wall or pipe is straight. I wanted to know what one of these things looked like, so I took myself to Canadian Tire and asked for a plumb bob. The helpful person who served me asked what it was for, so I explained as best I could, trying to figure out where to look. And she asked me what I was going to use it for. I couldn't help answering, "I need it for my sermon." "Oh," she said, "so here it is, my newly acquired plumb bob and plumb line, with which I can measure the straightness of my walls." Amos tells us that God will measure the uprightness of humanity. God will plumb our hearts as a plumb line measures the straightness of a city, and he calls Amos to be his prophet to a city that has become politically corrupt. It is not easy to be a prophet. As we have heard in recent weeks, it often means delivering a difficult message to people who don't want to hear it and who put up numerous obstacles. When Amos is commanded to confront Israel with its misdeeds, the kingdom is living in a period of unprecedented wealth, power and prestige. Many of us in Canada live in a similar context, taking for granted the privilege and advantage that many of us possess. We are living in a very challenging time. Just as we are emerging from 15 months of COVID restrictions, we are confronted with the horror of bodies of Indigenous children buried in unmarked graves. The reality of residential schools is not new information, and many were aware that Indigenous children were buried in school sites. We have watched on the news, followed the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, and begun to formulate our Anglican response to the 99 calls to action. But something different is happening now. God's plumb line is measuring our hearts as a nation and showing us that we are not quite who we thought we were. Our national pride this Canada Day was somewhat subdued, tempered by what we are learning about the experiences of Indigenous people. We could at this time be totally despondent as we hear daily that more graves have been discovered and that there will surely be many more. But as people of faith, we may be filled with anguish with the sheer wrongness of how the Indigenous people of the country have been treated, but we are not hopeless. Because God holds his plumb line over our nation. And Amos tells us today that God will transform our hearts, God will transform our thinking, and God will bring light to the truth that will set us all free and put us on the path to an entirely new relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And there are signs that God is bringing about this transformation. The first one is that a collective consciousness raising is taking place among non-Indigenous Canadians. The second is that so many Indigenous leaders have stated that they do not blame the people of today for what happened in the past. What they want is to be heard, to be understood, and to have an equitable relationship going forward. The third sign of hope is that for the first time we have an Indigenous Governor General. These are all transformative signs of hope that God is bringing about, setting his plumb line over our nation and restoring us to the upright people he created us to be. The prophet Amos today calls us, across the centuries, to be a prophetic church in our own time of anguish. What does this look like? The prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair. This is our prophetic calling as a church during this heartbreaking time. It is loud and clear. Speaking truth to power has never been easy or risk-free. Examples such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrate this. Nevertheless, the truth has to be spoken and the truth has to emerge. God promises to set a plumb line in the people's midst and to remain with them. There is a tone of unmistakable judgment in this. God will lay to waste the corrupt system because it is warped and beyond repair. But there is also the unmistakable theme of God's faithfulness. God still calls us my people. God's promise in this passage is to set a plumb line in the midst of the people, a line that judges the crookedness of the wall which is currently in place, but which promises a new construction as plumbed by God's plumb line. So it is for us in Canada today. In all the despair, God is setting a new plumb line, reconstructing us as a country, as a people, remaking us to be upright, strong, and true. Amen.
I waited for the Lord, he
We believe in a loving God whose word sustains our lives and the work of our hands in the world. God is life. We believe in God's Son amongst us, sowing the seeds of life's renewal. He lived with the poor to show the meaning of love. Jesus Christ is Lord. We believe in the Holy Spirit of life, making us one with God, renewing our strength with her own. The Spirit is love.
Prayers of the people for July 11th. To the petition, God of light and mercy, please respond saying, "Hear our prayer." God of mercy and grace, you lovingly come among us. Speak peace as you teach us to pray. Help us to see ourselves in the light of that love, and so our view of others and the whole world is shaped by your grace. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of peace, we pray for a world in turmoil, for those peoples and nations who find it hard to see each other with love and mercy, for all whose anger spills out in divisive and destructive ways, that their hearts might be changed and the way for peace opened. We pray for all who are grieving amid the continuing trauma of the discovery of unmarked graves of beloved children at former residential schools. We pray for guidance and direction as we respond to the calls to action and seek new and right relationships. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of strength and insight, we ask your blessing on our clergy and the ways they seek to care for us and work to strengthen our faith. Help them and all who share in ministry to live and serve with thanksgiving, joy, and peace. We pray for Linda, our primate, Mark, primate of our National Indigenous Church, Lynn, our metropolitan, Anna, our bishop, and Donna, our priest. We pray for the St. Peter and St. Paul Esquimalt and their clergy, Gail and Susan, and for the Diocese of Kootenay and their Bishop, Lynn. In the Anglican cycle of prayer, we pray for the Episcopal Church in the Philippines and for their prime Bishop, Joel. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of wisdom and compassion, help us find the ways to reach the minds and hearts of the leaders of this world, our country, and our community, so that as your people, we can find ways to live together in unity and godly love. We pray for Queen Elizabeth, the Governor General, the Prime Minister, the Premier, and our local civic leaders. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of companionship and healing, anoint those who are in despair, those who live with illness and pain, and strengthen and encourage those who care for them. We pray for our world amid this pandemic. Draw near to all who struggle. Bring peace, patience, and hope. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of understanding and hope, allay the pain of the grieving and give peace to their aching hearts. Help them and us to know that their loved ones are joyfully received into everlasting life. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. God of silence and wonder, we pause in this moment to offer our heartfelt thanks for prayers answered, joys shared, and for the moments of transformation and healing we have known in our lives. Help us to live in a way that your gifts to us are multiplied. God of light and mercy, hear our prayer. Redeeming Sustainer, visit your people and pour out your strength and courage upon us, that we may hurry to make you welcome not only in our concern for others, but by serving them generously and faithfully. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus, who taught us to pray, saying, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Rejoice, the Lord is King, the Lord and King adore. Rejoice, give thanks and sing on triumph evermore. Lift up your heart, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I sing, rejoice. Jesus the Savior reigns, the God of truth and love. When He had purged our sins, He took His seat above. Lift up your hearts, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I sing, rejoice. His kingdom cannot fail, He rules forever and ever. The keys of death and hell are to our Jesus give. Lift up your heart, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I say, rejoice. He sits at God's right hand, till all His foes submit, and bow to His command, for beneath His feet. Lift up your heart, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I sing, rejoice. Rejoice in glorious hope, Jesus the just shall come, and take His servants up to their eternal home. We soon shall hear the angels host the sound,
Now you go.
Beloved, the peace of Christ be always with you. Life is short, and we do not have too much time to gladden the way of those who travel with us. So be swift to love, make haste to be kind, and the blessing of the God who has created you, the Christ who has befriended you, and the Spirit who has gifted you, be with you this day and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you.